Good evening, everyone. It's my honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Helen Whall as our special speaker today. I've known Helen for over 6 years now, and whenever I've invited her to our library or to the Shakespeare Club of Grafton, Helen has accepted my invitation graciously and wowed audiences with her knowledge of Shakespeare and with her style of presentation that is so attractive and appealing, even to lay people like me, who are just fans of the bard, not necessarily Shakespeare scholars. There is no one more qualified than Helen to talk about the effects of the plague on Shakespeare's writing and on life in London, especially for theatre goers during Shakespeare's time. So Helen, please enlighten us and tell us what was the equivalent of Zoom in the late 15th and early 17th centuries.
I am intrigued not just by what we have the plague doing to Shakespeare, but why we, in the middle of our pandemic, are so interested in Shakespeare. It is really fascinating to me that when we shut down in March, essays started to appear in the New Yorker, in the Atlantic, then in the popular press about Shakespeare and the plague. And although I like to think as, Shakespeare as this common phenomenon we all talk about over dinner, don't think so. So I've got a few ideas about that I'm going to try to use to help maybe organize a great deal of material. I'd love you, if you could, to use the chat function. Anytime you have a question, we won't get to them until the end, but it might keep you from having to think up your thought after you've already had it. And what was I going to ask? So feel free to hit chat, and Priya will observe for us. I think there's a multiple part answer that I find as fascinating as Shakespeare to why we're interested now in the life he lived during plague years. The obvious is that Shakespeare did indeed live through many cycles of the plague. And we don't want to think of ours as in any way as cyclic as the bubonic plague. There we go. All right.
Great.
Yeah, that's better. Now we're going to have everyone, I think. And we're going to especially, let's see what happens here. Okay. It's still not on my speaker view, but at least I get to see you all. Okay, so he's the plague as we're thinking of it, the bubonic plague, was very cyclic. He was born into a year of the plague. So there's the sheer fact of that exposure to plague, and we'll get back to. One of those survival strategies that the Europeans and English developed, we knew so little about bubonic plague, but perhaps somewhat instinctively, they did learn about isolation. And one way of controlling plague when they had no vaccine or even the concept of vaccine was to shut down public spaces, the pubs, the meeting halls, the theaters. Not, however, the churches. Some kind of interesting resistance that you'll find similar as well. And so the theater that Shakespeare worked in is also shut down. On March 12th, theaters in New York shut down, and they have not reopened. We're starting to see locally some attempts at safely distanced small theater. We have to support as much as we can, I think, that kind of reality of theater and how collaborative a function it has. But the theater that we think of in the States and the West End in London, it's too dangerous right now. Very similar to what Shakespeare's town elders were doing. This they knew would help. They didn't know why. They didn't know how the plague was contagious. So we closed down on March 12th, and the first of the articles in the big press on Shakespeare and the plague is March 14th. I don't think it's coincidental. The life of theater is so important to us, even if you have to take it by extension to when will I get to see a movie in a theater again? Now, that's not the same as live theater, but our experience of it and of the desire to be in a group at a production, it may begin to at least simulate that. I was lucky enough to get into New York whenever I could afford it and go to the live theater. And I so miss the magic of live theater. So we have plague in the past and theater shut down. A plague of its kind, a pandemic now, and theater shuts down. Then there's the issue, and it came out on that March 14th essay. Well, what did Shakespeare do in the plague? That's where it gets a little tough. That's where this wonderful man, great Shakespearean and historian James Shapiro, tells us he wrote King Lear. Sure beats sourdough starter. I mean, what did you do in the first 6 weeks of the plague other than gain 15 pounds doing comfort food and baking bread? He wrote King Lear. All right. Now that we'll get around to. I'm not going to hold that as the bar that we must all rise to. It certainly intimidated people when they rated for Shapiro in the New Yorker article to mention that little fact. But that then brings us back to, well, why do we continue having been hit over the head with now I have to write a 5-act great tragedy? No, but it might be time for us to talk about one and look at one and thank God, even see online the Royal Shakespeare's production of it that you can get streaming. We're trying hard to use the technology and hopefully the medical advances we have to get out of our plague more quickly and to the salvation of many whose jobs are caught up in it. I think then the last link inside of all this brings it back full circle. Shakespeare is our common link. It's not just the plague and theater shutting down links us back to Shakespeare, but Shakespeare comes forward to us. You probably all have some interest and familiarity with Shakespeare, or I'll bet you wouldn't be here just to hear about the plague. That, but that said, almost everyone knows something about Shakespeare. We can have all kinds of discussions about, is it the Shakespeare business that's kept him alive? As a member of the Shakespeare business, I said, no, if it won't travel, the business won't carry. That there is something about Shakespeare having been the great man of the Renaissance theater that has kept him alive. We're less familiar, sadly now, are certainly poets like Milton and Spenser, someone as great as Shakespeare, whose performances are what we are meant to participate in, lives on. The fact that I think he was a genius and that his words and his concepts still reach out as well, but it becomes a kind of a common link that, oh yeah, Shakespeare, even if you didn't read Romeo and Juliet, you know the story. I mean, it's been used in ad copy, if nowhere else. Let me use those kind of 4 landmarkers to see what I can do about spending your time wisely before we go off to the world of a national debate. Or we could just stay here. First, the plague thing. I think it's probably important, and it has been important to some of those essays that have been written, to realize what we mean when we speak of the plague. First of all, plague, it's a Latin word, plaga, is not necessarily the bubonic plague. We're going to be talking about a specific plague, but that word plague has much more resonance. Think of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Think of the 7 plagues of Revelations. It's something disastrous that happens. And then it gets drawn specifically into a medicalization. And even then, you can start talking about different kinds of phenomena of medical plagues. As far as we know, what we're going to look at, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, one of the worst of all of the awful things that pestilence can bring. It's been traced back at least 2,000 years in various digs in the ancient lands. At least the pathogen still inside of some of those. So it's been around a very long time. It grew and grew more fierce. Our first real kind of record of early medieval contact with plague is in the 4th century, and anywhere the Roman Empire touched. The learning soon how the plague traveled from place to place will become part of isolation and shutdown that we are also, haven't improved on too much yet. And it's the pandemic proportions that travel trade routes, military encampments were able to bring that plague around the world. As we start to watch, as we move into the Renaissance, which is earlier in Europe than it is in England, an isolated island, it makes sense to us now that it could travel once we had perfected international travel. And it's so tied into global success stories, only it's on ships. We know after the fact what they did not know at the time of the bubonic plague, that it's transmitted both through the air and through flea bites. And the fleas that would ride on the rats would ride in the ships, making a major transportation modality, the ship, especially problematic. This is why I find it really kind of fascinating that we have pretty good dating on how the plague ended up in Europe. Italian sailors had been on the Bosphorus and then in the town of Kaffa. They got into some fisticuffs with Mongols and appear to have contracted the plague out of the Mongol encounter. Then, looking for the solace of home, not knowing they were carrying the plague, headed back to Italy. Along the way, most would die, and those who did not arrive in Sicily in October of 1347. And the story from there is what begins the horrific notion of pandemic. The sailors, the dead bodies we didn't know at that time, burn the dead. The infected who were not yet showing the tremendous marks, the boils and buboes of the plague, walked around the city. Isolation would be learned too late to stop the plague from entering into Europe. Within the next year, the plague had spread to Paris, Bordeaux, Florence, Lyon. It was over the world, and it would come to London. It's the Italians who set for home then have made it possible for the expansion that and it's a long bout, between 1347 and 1350, 3 years, we estimate at a minimum 20 million Europeans died. Our numbers are horrific, but think of that because we're talking about a third of the population of the continent. And just the devastation, the horror that then becomes associated with that word plague, although we're talking about a specific one. That plague didn't really end until the 19th century, although it grew less and less present amongst us. It was the Venetians who the Venetians were really smart fellows, and it's the Venetians who, somewhere in that period, just before 1350, learned to keep arriving sailors, again, in isolation. And they took that first for 30 days, a Trentino, realized that wasn't doing it enough, so they went to a quarantino, and that's the origin of the word that we still use, of a quarantine. So we have a linguistic indebtedness to this period as well. Since so little was known about treating the plague, strange things developed that reflect the kind of reaching out that we get to try to control something we don't understand. This included a cult of flagellants, of monks and religious men who'd go from town to town, flagellating themselves in order to drive away the plague. This led to an amazing rise of anti-Semitism, as some decided that, the Jews are poisoning the wells. And you have tremendous persecution going on in this period. This is when you have the plague doctors develop, and I find this interesting, you've seen those haunting masks with the long beak, covered in leather clothing. In retrospect, though, now we've often looked at those disguises, as it were, as another part of the silliness, as bloodletting. The long beak had herbs at the end of it, and it was thought that the fumes could go through that, and the herbs would kill the fumes before it hit the nose of the doctor. It's been mocked, but I wonder, in some odd way, if that wasn't the beginning of masking, although not yet understanding why and how. But again, the sense of the horror of plague, you see that mask recreated now in Carnival. The whole Carnivale aspect, Venice would take it over and incorporate it into its way. Eventually, that medieval plague did not so much burn out as kind of go dormant. And when it next appears, it's in a 10-year cycle. England is particularly hit. In the earlier plagues, England was partially protected by the fact that it was an island, a small and emerging country. Its Renaissance was a good 100 years behind the European Renaissance. But ironically, as England becomes more of a global player and more sophisticated, it's more vulnerable to the plague. And then the very nature of it as an island nation also makes it a kind of a quarantined island. Shakespeare was born into one of the first of the great Renaissance era English plagues, 1564. He's born in the prosperous but rural town of Stratford. He has had 2 brothers die before him. His parents know what plague can mean, and they appear to have done a very good job of protecting him from that plague. He will keep escaping the plague almost from that birth, because he's going to have many years where he confronts the plague. And we know that when he shows up in England around 1588, we for sure know that he's already fairly successful when in 1592, a very nervous contemporary of his, Green, writes another playwright, writes a testament, which is a groat's worth of wit, in which he calls Shakespeare this magpie who steals our words, this shake scene. And, this is and it's this kind of anger that this newfangled fellow who's also stealing our thunder is in town. And that's how we learn. Shakespeare is in England as an actor and as a playwright. Now, considering that he has chosen to be an actor and a playwright, we don't, by the way, think he was a very successful actor. I think this is kind of comforting. So right, he wrote King Lear, but he couldn't remember his lines. The way we've discovered that is that people studying the speeches we know he wrote for himself in some of his plays have very few words. Shakespeare wrote for himself the role of Hamlet Sr., the ghost. Swear! Now, if that isn't a psychological trick to his friend Burbage, who's playing Hamlet, I'm your ghostly father and inspiration. He wrote for himself the very small part of Adam in As You Like It. Again, I am the progenitor, and Adam has a wonderful little speech inside of the play. So these are suggestions that it's a good thing he was such a great writer, because that was where he was going to be, and he was going to be a shareholder in his theater. Watch how his success and wealth begin to contribute to his survival of the plague. Again, another bit of connection to the world in which we now live. But what Shakespeare does work for is this theater, which is itself pretty new. So think of all these factors. Now we're narrowed in from the world to Europe to London, all right? We're kind of coming in close. And I suppose for that former colony of particular interest to us, because you also want to think about what's happening with the elements that will lead to the settlement of the states in this same period, and then finally to the rebellion. But what we have now is that world of theater. The first successful professional theater is 1576. And I'm telling you that Shakespeare was well established as playwright and actor by 1592. He's there by 1588. Just a scant 12 years after the first professional theaters. And that liveliness, if we can imagine our way back to what's before that. And this is a very interesting kind of the complexity of theater's integral working into our lives, our cultural existence, but also the legalities and the commerce that come into theater. In 1573, 3 years before that professional theater, Queen Elizabeth expanded the Vagrancy Acts that her father had established. And these were acts deliberately targeting the poor and the mendicant and the itinerant. Her expansion took these acts, which were forcing the poor outside the city walls, took the act and extended it to jugglers, lutists, singers, and entertainers. And awful though that sounds, and it is the kind of suspicion that circulates around the world of entertainment, the kind of love-hate relationship we have with it all. Oddly, nothing better probably could have been done for professional theater than that aspect of the Vagrancy Act. Because the exception was if your troupe could find sponsorship from the court or from the judiciary, the states, you could survive. Hence, you have things like the Lord Admiral's men, the Lord Chamberlain's men, that will become the King's men. Once you have that notion of sponsorship, you have organization beginning. So in 1576, when James Burbage actually creates the first successful outdoor theater, he's got it as a business concern. You look around London, we're no longer in the agrarian world of medieval England. We're in the urban environment of guilds, of craftsmen, of baby unions. And this is how theater was designed, around the guild system. You would have shareholders, masters, apprentices. Right? It's a business. And to become a shareholder, which Shakespeare would eventually, is the major way to win the game. And I have to constantly remind people, Shakespeare was a businessman. If you ever want to have, the notion, oh no, artists must starve in garrets. He wouldn't have agreed with that. That does not necessarily in any way undercut the quality of his artistry. We'll get there too. Well, what would that theater be like then? When Burbage, who is his son, is an actor, but James Burbage is strictly a businessman. And when he sets up that first theater, what's it going to look like? We've not had one. He looks at the bear pits that are also the entertainment in London of the time. And he copies, and you've seen the image of the globe with its open, I've got it behind me, the open sky, the big hexagonal building. That right next to it, you can see on many a map, a bear pit that looks just like it. In the bear pit, the bear would be tied to a stake in the middle of the stage, dogs set upon him. And the same audience that might wander over to the theater would bet on how many dogs would live. It was cockfighting with bears and dogs. Horrible thing. But to think of, this was entertainment. And we opened the theater, and the theater is opened with Burbage saying, hey, if it doesn't take off, I can always turn it into a bear pit. What does it mean, though? That theater is big. I was shocked the first time I got to go to London after they had opened the reconstructed Globe Theater. I mean, it was wonderful and great and all that, but truly my first thing was I walked inside and I said, it's so small, because I knew it could hold in Shakespeare's time 2,000 people. And if you've been there, that should shock you. I think they see and stand about 400 people in it right now. It's not just because we've gotten bigger. We have also come to expect our space and a certain amount of amenities. So it's a very packed theater, and it's a very participatory theater. These are the people standing for the most seats, or stand seats, cheek by jowl, close to each other. Perfect site of contagion, obviously. But think of the liveliness of it. Who went? We know people from every walk and category of life went to those theaters. Burbage's was about the first. 5, 6 would soon spread outside of the official walls of London, because the rising Puritan population, the town mayor, the London mayor, and I'm very nervous about theater, perhaps aware that it's a threat to plague, but anxious about, again, it's just another aspect of beer pits and brothels. Let's put it out there where it belongs. Well, so that world is there, and yet it's going to draw hundreds of people a week, mostly apprentices, but also some of the court, for whom Shakespeare knew his audience and for whom he was writing, and it was across an arc of society. It was a popular place. The hard thing I have now is that so much of our great theater, that stuff in New York I miss, is way too expensive. All right. This is the people should have access to the theater. That's why we have to support our regional and local places. But what you do have with that in Shakespeare's world, it was a penny entrance. Good, smart students would always ask me, yeah, sure, but what I know, maybe, bread costs, third of a penny or something like that, the inflation thing. In fact, apprentice's typical salary, and this is the lower end of the apprentice, was 12 pence. So a penny was a 12th of the weekly kind of salary of a typical apprentice, many making more. And we have records showing how many repeaters would go back to the theater. It was prosperous, it was successful, it was alive. And Londoners had never seen anything like it. Because before this time, you're looking at medieval theater out in the fields, and the plays were the mysteries and miracles. They were ways that the church was using to teach biblical stories and the coalescence of Roman Catholic sacraments. That was the concession the church made to theater. It was so nervous about theater and the way in which it might steal our souls, that when the church came to its concession point and said, okay, you can have theater, they decided, but you have to stick with the Bible, stick with the saints, and you can't let women act. This would carry over into Shakespeare's theater. All of those wonderful parts, from Juliet to Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, were played by young men. And so again, there's so much texture going on as we continue to look at and wonder of the role of the actor and the kind of double-edged sword that we bring to our admiration and suspicion of, yeah, but how can I tell when they're telling the truth because they act? So there's anxiety around the theater to begin with, but there's also tremendous interest. Up until about that period of the professional theater, there's no plays other than those mysteries and miracles in English. So it also provided playwrights with a job, and we know they were churning them out at $100 a month in English. We've lost most of them, probably to the bottom of bird cages, and not wrongly either. But again, the parallels. I'll bet your TV watching habits have gotten better as you've run out of the usual stuff and have been exploring your Netflix, and maybe started seeing a few foreign films that we'd never heard of before, as the writers in Hollywood themselves have had to delay the release of our entertainment. And so you start digging around. So, well, I haven't seen that. Oh, it's kind of interesting. You may have even read something, watched something with subtitles. So there's that pressure, that desire, still for that simultaneous, it's entertainment, but it's not just entertainment. Audiences get the theater they deserve. We've said that about people in the governments too, and sometimes frightening. But I'm hoping we're going to come out of this with heightened expectations, at least with the quality of film and television. Theater has been doing pretty well, modern theater, in generating some amazing new plays over the last 20 years, 50 years. It's been some pretty good stuff. So we have the theater prospering, Shakespeare joins it, and it does take off. He's one of the good ones. His plays are tremendously successful and popular enough that we actually do still have texts today. That's partly because his company saw to it. In 1592, that same year that Green writes about Shakespeare as this upstart crow, the plague hit again. We'd not had a really big cycle of it since 1564. But in 92, it hits hard. And with the theaters now well established, the first thing that governors realized is we have to shut the theater down. It is the source of contagion. And indeed, that outbreak did send Shakespeare into downtime. What did he do in that first plague? He was probably working on Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet. What we know for sure he was doing, he is successful, he is not wealthy, is he's turned to patronage. He can stay home because he's no longer making most of his money as an actor. He's not yet a shareholder, but he writes Venus and Adonis, and and he writes other works that are long dedicated poems that allow him to have it's that system of the artist and patronage that goes back to the classical period, and it let him keep body and soul together as we go through that pandemic. There are some references, but not a lot, in the poems to plague, and people keep asking, well, what does Shakespeare think about the plague? Doesn't write about it much, even in though one of the plays that he will write, Romeo and Juliet, we'll get back to. I'm as much interested in what's keeping Shakespeare alive during this period. He comes back and writes some of his greatest comedies in the period that follows. And then in 1601, the plague breaks out again. It claimed the lives of 30,000 Londoners. That's a big number. The King's Privy Council ordered all the theaters shut. Whenever the number of attendants rose above, the number of deaths in the city rose above the number of 30 in a week. 2 years later, an even larger outbreak of plague saw many, many more times the deaths of that. So it's a learning cycle. Now the plague has gone cyclic. By then, by the 1601-1602 period, Shakespeare was independently wealthy from the theater. In the earlier years, we think he may have gone briefly on tour with the company in addition to writing those dedicated poems. We know that the various acting companies went out into the burbs, out into the ruin, away from the plague, and did some performing, right? So that itinerant player thing comes back into play. But by 1602, when the theaters are closed again, he no longer has to write dedicated poetry. He lives in, we know more about Shakespeare than people like to think they do. He lives in a very prosperous, safe district of London, St. Olave's Parish. We know where he lived, on Silver Street. They know the death counts, very low on that street. And he moves, it appears, when his landlady dies, presumably of the plague. But he is able to spend a decade in that Silver Street home housing just writing things like Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra, as well as King Lear. Looking at the interlocking aspects, though, the business end of theater and the kind of, as well as the aesthetic end of the issue of equity in a community that's facing pandemic, Shakespeare's story, as well as the stories he writes, can become illustrative of something I think we're experiencing as well. Between those months, there was another long closing, which leads us to wonder, well, what did Shakespeare write about the plague? Between 1602 and 1613, because the plague kept popping up in that whole decade, off and on, 87 months the theater was closed. So, think of how precarious it had become. It played in effect for 9 months, scattered in between. This has to have had a huge impact on everyone associated. What did Shakespeare write about the plague? I'm here going to be a bit contrarian because there is a Shakespeare's about all of his plague references that a few scholars out there are marketing, and I'm going to say he didn't write much about the plague at all, and I have my own reason why, and I will try to prove it to you. Shakespeare and the plague, really important, but I think by indirection. So let us watch and see what he did do. I'd mentioned that in 1592, he was probably working on Romeo and Juliet. And you know the story of that play, at least in its big guidelines. But this is the one and only time Shakespeare uses the plague as a plot point. Romeo has been driven from the city after marrying Juliet. Juliet is about to be married off by her parents to Paris because they don't know that she's run off with Romeo. He's been banished for killing her cousin Tybalt. It's all a mess. And this friar gets this bright idea. We'll have Juliet pretend she has killed herself, but I'll have given her a potion that will give her sleeping beauty conditions of 3 days sleep. I'll send a messenger to tell Romeo, don't worry about it if you hear she's dead, because she's taken a magic potion. Right? Only one thing goes wrong. The messenger, another friar, tells us that he is held up. I could not send it, here it is again, nor get a messenger to bring it to thee. So fearful were they of infection. And the prior that has been held because the guards think that he has actually crossing city limits, but he's been in a house that's been touched by plague. That's the plot, and it becomes a very important plot point because that letter doesn't arrive in Romeo's hands on time. He hears that Juliet is dead before he hears that no, she isn't. Rushes back, right, and actually will go to that tomb, believe she's dead, and kill himself and her to wait to him. In this one, Shakespeare seems to be using the plague, as he has many other devices inside of that play, as an aspect of fate, as an aspect of, well, you got to get him one way, you're going to get him another. How do you react to the blockers that are put along the way? Earlier in the play, actually, his best friend Mercutio, who's dying on the streets of Verona, says to those around him, to the Capulets and the Montagues, a plague on both your houses. That's the kind of reference to the plague Shakespeare more commonly makes. It's the metaphoric. And for Mercutio to wish a plague upon the houses of the Capulets and Montagues is to really curse them. Mercutio is neither, but has died because of both. That kind of reference will come up, and just more. So that if I do, and I always share with people who don't know this trick, absolutely after this, learn this trick, go Google in Shakespeare concordance. And the concordance, you'll have two different choices of online concordances. What a concordance lets you do, and the Shakespeare is the best, is type in any word you see, and it will tell you how many times he used it and where he used it. And you can look so smart, like me, because I can tell you, having never looked at the concordance, that he used the word plague 98 times in 29 plays. Now, that's straight from the concordance. But then what you have to do is say, but how is he using that word? Sometimes the plague seems to be the generic plague before the bubonic plague. So, for example, in Hamlet, if thou dost marry, he's telling Ophelia, I'll give thee this plague for thy dowry. Be thou as chaste as ice, as pure as snow. Thou shalt not escape calumny. I don't think it's tremendously powerful or necessarily that clear. What kind of plague? Of the biblical kind? Of the bubonic kind is he talking about? Claudius will say himself that when he's worried about Hamlet, the queen, his mother, lives almost by his looks, and for myself, my virtue or my plague be it either which. Now, Stephen Greenblatt has done some wonderful work on Shakespeare, and he has a long essay in The Atlantic, if you would like to check it out, from the May edition. And he goes through many of these references. And this is where I'll park me. He sees these as bleeding, trauma, signs of trauma. They're a little generic for that, but that when we do get into some of the other plays, something else happens. So I'm going to turn now to King Lear, that play he baked instead of bread, and what happens in that. In Lear, we do get that kind of vague, ubiquitous use of plague. Edmund, in his famous soliloquy, he is going to be the bad guy who tries to steal the throne. Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom? Again, it's useful, it's good, but I don't hear, maybe it's just being deaf-toned, it's a metaphor. I don't necessarily hear deep trauma there. Maybe a bit more when Lear says to one of his daughters, I prithee, daughter, do not make me mad. I will not trouble thee, my child. Farewell. We'll no more meet, no more see one another. But yet thou art my flesh, my blood, my daughter, or rather, a disease that in my flesh, which I must needs call mine, thou art a boil, a plague sore, an embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood. Now that speaks a bit more to me of the bubonic plague and of trauma. And I think that King Lear, that play written during lockdown, is perhaps the play that shows us the power of the artist's work by indirection. When the play will be performed, he's addressing an audience that has survived the plague of boils and carbuncles. And Lear will be there for his own challenge. I think the real trauma comes out in that play, not in these occasional references to the word plague, or even to the phenomena, the tokens of plague, the boil, but rather to a call to his audience to consider how some people get through the plague when other people don't, and the societal aspect of a connectivity to each other. And that is when Lear, out on the heath, been driven out of his home by his daughter's unkindness, going mad, has a soliloquy. All the others with him, including the fool, he has asked to enter into protection, into housing, into a hovel that one of his men has found. And Lear alone gives a speech. Poor, remember, he's a king in his 80s. Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm. How shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Take physic pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayest shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just. That has always been for me one of the single most powerful speeches in all of Shakespeare. And I'm going to say that where he's using the storm, the brutality of indifferent nature, to appeal to us all are. Look at the second half of that speech. First, poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you? How do the homeless, the poor, those without sufficient means, how do they survive? He has. He's done well. He's in a job that he can keep. He's in a place where he can save. But the most important thing I point out to you is that until 2000, the year 2000 AD, we have Bartlett Shakespeare quotations used by so many in law, in Congress, in the Senate. uses that passage and stops at as your looped-in windowed raggedness defend you from such seasons as these. Cuts it off there. The most important part of the speech follows. I have taken too little care of this. And that's what blows his mind. Damn, I didn't do it while I could. For me, this is addressing the reality of what he's lived through and reaching out across the ages more to us than any singular plague. But there is that great man of the theater reaching out to us in another way. He did survive. Most of us will. The theater survived. It will. We have to take care of each other for any of those things to happen. And that's where I'm going to, before turning over to you for questions, I want to go then to a living person in today's theater. And this is one of my former students, the director, Bart Scher. Now, Bart was the director of South Pacific, The King and I, My Fair Lady, and on March 12th had to shut down his hugely successful production of To Kill a Mockingbird, which he hopes he'll be able to return to someday. Bart gave me a call early in the summer, before I ever knew I was going to do this talk, to ask me to, talk to me about Shakespeare and the Plague. And I knew exactly what he was up to. He'd been asked to write an essay for the journal Stage Directors and Choreographers on Shakespeare and the stage. Bart had done a great deal of Shakespeare direction in his younger years in regional theater. I have told him that before I die or he does, he has to stage King Lear for me. A hard, hard challenge. Bart's essay was published last week. So we should listen, I think, to someone from our era. And this is how he closes the essay. When I learned about the Renaissance in school, I recall the extraordinary etymology of the word. It means rebirth. It was probably the most transformative time of the last 1,000 years until now, because I now realize we get to be a part of a new Renaissance, a genuinely new rebirth. He's talking here specifically to theater people, but it's for us too. When the theaters were closed in 1592, Shakespeare made the most of his time. They were shut then for 14 months. When I do that math now, I look to next May and am determined and renewed that we will return to a completely and fully changed world of the theater, where what we make next and how we make it will be profoundly transformed for the better. In the middle of his essay had talked about George Floyd and the role of theater in diversity. Back to Bart. In the course of that, the most social of beings, theater people, who live in the most intense and constant community of any profession on earth, have gone into seclusion and been cut off from the lifeblood of our work, our colleagues, our creative families. We have watched our friends suffer and die and tried to ask ourselves hard questions about those inner lives, their sacred work we engage in, that we call theater. I may dimly understand the mystery of why Shakespeare never wrote about the plague. I think it was a deep part of life, but it wasn't the important part. The important part was creating worlds and work that could lift and transform himself and us. And that is the work we have ahead. It has been horrible putting the brakes on life, and we have endured much suffering in the entire course of events. But there is deep hope that this crucible will have been required to return and engage in a new, a better, a more just theater. I would say that the challenge is there for us too. We get to act. We are actors. And on that note, I hope to see you soon in an actual theater, not even a metaphoric one. Let's see what we can do about finding some questions from you people before I call on you like I used to in class.
Yeah.
Have we got Priya?
Sure. We have a question from Judith. She wants to know if you're familiar with the novel called Hamnet. But
Ah,
then,
I'm promising you that I have Hamnet on my Kindle, and I'm going to read it soon. And this is terrible. I let that book go for a while because of Brownings's last terrible movie, which I'm even blocking on the name of the title right now. All is true. Oh, it's terrible. Don't even watch it in the lockdown. I mean, but it was all about Shakespeare's grief for the dead Hamlet. And so that kind of boiled me away, but I do have it now. You like it? Is it Julia? You've enjoyed it?
Judith,
I just
she wants to know
learned
if you
about
read
it
it.
today. I just learned about it today from a friend who really enjoyed it. She said it was well written, and she wanted me to ask you about it.
That's everything I've heard. And then if you want another one, you can look at Ian McEwan's, this one I have read, Nutshell, which is Hamlet speaking from the womb.
Okay.
It's amusing. It's very funny. Other questions?
There's one from Rob. He asks, during the pandemic theater closures, does history record any public opposition to the closures?
No, not that I have access to, but that is an interesting kind of, what remains the kind of constant is that I'm sure there were underground saloons. I can't believe that there weren't at the time, but there's no record of rebellion. Now, we are under a more than, I guess, authoritarian regime, as far as what would we think of even doing. I'd love to know, I really would love to know whether people were putting on their own secret little plays in their bubbles, in their circles or not, but I do not know. It's never talked about, but it's a really interesting question.
Don't see any more questions in the chat. Wonder if anyone has any questions.
Or objections, demonstrations, take me elsewhere, you know.
Vanessa wants to know, what was the reopening of theater like? Did it all happen at once?
Oh, it's sporadic. I mean, in that period where it's only open for 9 months, the way it would be suggested is that the various theaters each had its own flag that would fly. If the flag was up, the theater was open. I can only imagine, you know, what that must have been like, because I don't think that the epidemiology of it all was in any way understood enough to make, I don't know. I mean, I wonder when I'll next go indoors at a restaurant. Yeah, indoors even at a theater, unless it's outdoors. I'm looking forward to so much summer theater in parks. You know, we can have this and have it safely.
Yes. Did Shakespeare's family survive the plagues?
Oh yes, they were, and this is what many are interested in, is that Shakespeare does not seem to have fled from London to Stratford at any time during that period. There are lots of speculations on what his own home life was like. I think it may be, you know, imposed retrospectively, but he was by this point very prosperous and had built for his family the largest house in Stratford. And it's quite beautiful. We're not sure what Hamnet died of. There's no one speaks of it as being plague. I think of it as mysterious movie industry type sickness, you know, kind of, but we don't know other than that. And that would have been quite early in his career. His family seems to have not suffered much through it at all. Again, you know, we have to admit it. Economics has a whole lot to do with survival. And I think he's accepting that and aware of that. Wow. But it's a good way of spending time. We're not killing time. We're spending time. And it's a spending of time, to use the economics metaphor, that's an investment in time as well, because it does stay with you. I really do think that what artists like Shakespeare are trying to do is what Emily Dickinson spoke of, the artist's task. Tell the truth, but tell it slant. And the slant leaves us all free to dig in and see, in what way can I make meaning of this text that's helping me to make meaning of my world? We have opportunities to come together, not simply to enjoy a play, but to talk to each other about the plays that we've enjoyed. And so if I see no more hands up,
That's good.
Roseanne?
Yeah. Great job.
Oh, thank you, Roseanne. And the fact that I know her name means she's a plant. I've recognized a few of you out there. Yes, Rob, you're going to tell me all about the law and vagrancy laws and how they might impact the theater. A few of my usual suspects out there, and I'm thankful to you all for coming along, old colleagues as well, and great friends from Shrewsbury, whom I've met with the Shakespeare group that you have in Shrewsbury. Priya, always thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you all so very much.
illuminating history.
Thank you, Helen.
Stay safe, stay well, okay? Bye-bye.
Hope
Thank
we
you.
can welcome you to the library next year.
Oh, good, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.